Okay, let's just dive straight into it. Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a geopolitical standoff between the United States and Cuba that's been quietly drifting toward the danger zone for a while, but has suddenly, and I mean suddenly, reached an absolute boiling point. This decades-old conflict has officially entered a totally unprecedented phase.
Right off the bat, you have to hear this recent remark from the US president. We may stop by Cuba after we're finished with this. I mean, wow. Fresh off the heels of interventions in places like Iran and Venezuela, this abruptly throws Cuba right back into the crosshairs. The administration is signaling very heavily that the Iran nation is next up on the agenda. It's incredibly unpredictable, but honestly, that unpredictability might be exactly the point. It's a strategy completely designed to keep Havana guessing.
And to really wrap your head around the domestic stakes driving this, you just have to look at the polling. A staggering 79% of Cubans and Cuban Americans in South Florida support some form of U.S. military intervention, almost 8 in 10. So, this isn't just some abstract, distant foreign policy debate happening in a vacuum. There is immense, highly concentrated domestic pressure demanding a resolution. And you better believe politicians in Washington know this could be a massive political win.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. The brink of regime change. 2. Decades of flip-flopping policy. 3. The maximum pressure campaign. 4. Diplomacy under threat. And finally, 5. The political wildcard. Let's start with part 1, the brink of regime change. We really need to look at the immediate threat and how a potential military operation against Havana would actually play out on the ground. The absolutely crucial factor here is the element of surprise. Think back to when the U.S. moved against Maduro in Venezuela. The Navy spent months publicly building up forces, right? Well, Cuba is a totally different story. Because it's literally right next door, an intervention could launch directly from domestic U.S. bases with almost zero warning. The options they're considering range from a lightning-fast raid to capture senior leaders like Diaz-Canel to a widespread air campaign hitting military sites, or even a full-scale invasion, though, to be fair, that last one is the least likely. But make no mistake, the threat is immediate.
Moving to part 2, decades of flip-flopping policy. Because to understand today's crisis, we kind of have to take a quick step back and look at the absolute whiplash of American foreign policy over the last few decades. U.S. strategy has been ping-ponging ever since Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959. For decades, it was this constant struggle between isolation versus engagement. We had Clinton seriously tightening the embargo in 1996 with the Helms-Burton Act, which set wildly strict conditions for lifting sanctions. Then you get a massive pivot in 2014 when Obama restored diplomatic relations. But because hardliners in the Cuban government resisted real structural reforms, their economy was left incredibly fragile. So when the U.S. rolled back that normalization in 2017, Cuba's economy essentially went into a free fall that it just hasn't recovered from since Diaz-Canel took power. Which brings us to part 3, the maximum pressure campaign. That historical vulnerability set the stage perfectly for January 2026, when the U.S. decided to systematically squeeze the Cuban state like never before. By officially designating Cuba an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, the administration basically unlocked a massively powerful legal framework. This wasn't just tough talk. This designation let them slap an aggressive 30% tariff on any country anywhere in the world that dared to supply oil to Cuba. It was a highly calculated move to totally choke off the island's most critical resource. And when you look at the numbers, the core of the crisis is just a massive, undeniable deficit. To simply keep its civil service running, Cuba needs roughly 100,000 barrels of oil every single day. But they only produce about 40,000 domestically. That leaves a gaping 60,000-barrel hole, meaning the entire island is completely at the mercy of foreign suppliers just to keep the lights on. And once that 30% tariff hit, the global supply chain just evaporated. I mean, fuel tankers were literally turning around in the middle of the ocean. After a couple of rare shipments, one from Mexico in January and one from Russia in March, the supply essentially dropped to zero. Nobody else is sending oil. This strategy has effectively pushed Havana closer to an outright total blockade than at any point since the 1962 missile crisis. And we really have to recognize that this fuel shortage isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. It is causing the real-time collapse of basic societal functions. Gas lines take hours. Without fuel, garbage trucks are parked, and waste is literally piling up in the streets. Routine power outages mean hospitals have to cancel life-saving surgeries. And on top of that, public health systems are being overwhelmed by mosquito-transmitted disease outbreaks. We are seeing a level of sheer desperation that hasn't been seen there since the extreme economic crisis of the 1990s. Society is just grinding to a halt. Okay, part 4, diplomacy under threat. With the economy crashing and public pressure at a boiling point, Washington senses they have unprecedented leverage, and that sets up an incredibly high-stakes diplomatic standoff. So despite all the fiery rhetoric, back-channel diplomacy is actually happening. When an American State Department delegation landed in Havana in April, which, by the way, was the first U.S. government aircraft to land there in years, they brought a massive laundry list of demands. They want sweeping political freedoms, the release of all political prisoners, and huge financial compensation. Cuba, knowing they're on the brink of collapse, offered some concessions. They released 2,000 political prisoners and are letting expats own businesses. But over in Washington, those offers are falling completely flat. Because the giant roadblock in all of this is a staggering figure, $9 to $10 billion. According to anti-government organizations, that is the estimated value of American and diaspora assets that were confiscated way back after the 1959 revolution. The U.S. is demanding compensation for that. But given the complete economic collapse we just talked about, Havana simply has no way to pay out a sum that massive. It's practically an insurmountable hurdle. And because the Cubans are historically notorious for dragging their feet in diplomacy, Washington policymakers are convinced that normal negotiations will just stall out until the next election cycle. So the Pentagon feels they have to maintain this highly visible, ever-present threat. The logic is brutal but simple. Cuban leadership will only concede if they genuinely believe their power, their properties, and their lives are in immediate, imminent danger. And if talks do break down, the Pentagon isn't bluffing. They have a very clear escalation playbook. Step 1, turn up the heat with intense surveillance, positioning warships, and running highly visible drills all over the Caribbean. If Havana still won't budge, we go to Step 2, kinetic military action, meaning targeted airstrikes to cripple military infrastructure. And if that fails, Step 3, precise special operations raids targeting the senior officials themselves. Finally, Part 5, the political wild card. Because there is a fascinating twist to this whole geopolitical puzzle. And to understand it, we have to look at the actual people driving this policy in Washington. Strategically, this whole pressure campaign is pretty unusual. I mean, unlike Venezuela, Cuba doesn't have vast, vital oil reserves. And unlike Iran, they don't have a nuclear weapons program. So why this level of intense, laser-focused aggression? Well, it tells us that the driving force isn't just grand global strategy. It's actually heavily influenced by domestic American politics. And that brings us to Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He is the ultimate wild card here. As the son of Cuban immigrants, this isn't just foreign policy for him. It's deeply personal. He was one of the loudest critics of Obama's normalization and has effectively become the face of the U.S. posture toward Latin America. But here's why he matters so much. He has completely unique credibility. He can actually sell a deal to Capitol Hill, to the diaspora in Miami, and maybe even to Havana. However, his hands are mostly tied by the strict rules of the 1996 Helms-Burton Act, which legally demands free elections and dismantling the security state before the embargo can truly be lifted. But despite his history as a hardliner, Rubio recently gave a really revealing quote. He said, "Change in Cuba doesn't have to happen all at once because everyone is mature and realistic." That is a massive statement. It's a surprising hint at a much more gradual approach, suggesting he might be trying to thread a very, very delicate needle. It implies an openness to introducing reforms slowly to avoid total chaos, but doing that would mean balancing the fierce demands of Congress with the reality of an entrenched regime. It would be incredibly controversial. So as the economic squeeze pushes Cuban society to an absolute breaking point and the threat of American military action looms larger every single day, we're left with this final question. Marco Rubio might literally be the only person who can navigate this maze. But will Washington's complex domestic politics ultimately determine the fate of millions of people in Cuba? It's a pretty striking reminder that sometimes the biggest obstacles to international peace are sitting right at home. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.